The courtroom erupted like a fault line. 1 second, Judge Emmanuel Rhodes was speaking. The next, the order of the room fractured. A single, sharp sound ripped through the air, bouncing off marble walls and polished wood. The crowd froze, caught in the half-beat between disbelief and understanding. Security officers stiffened, their hands hovering over buttons and radios. The flag behind the bench fluttered once, caught in the whisper of air conditioning. The only movement in a room suddenly suspended. And in that silence, justice itself trembled. Hours earlier, the courthouse had been a machine of cold precision. Sunlight poured in through eastern glass panels, slicing the marble floors into rectangles of light. Dust motes hovered lazily, visible only when caught in the pale beams. Every corridor, every wall, every polished brass fixture seemed designed to remind those who entered. The system is older, stronger, and indifferent to your presence. Judge Rhodes walked these corridors alone before the city stirred fully awake. His polished shoes tapped in slow, measured rhythm, the echo bouncing off walls like metronomes counting out the heartbeat of law. The robe draped over his arm, his leather briefcase in the other. He carried authority in the way one carries a fragile instrument, aware that any misstep could fracture the illusion of order. At the security desk, Sergeant Mason Creel watched. A ring of keys drummed faintly against the edge of the counter, each metallic click a pulse in the otherwise silent morning. He looked the judge over once, briefly, as if appraising the room itself, and by extension every man within it. Rhodes lifted his ID badge to the scanner. The electronic beep was polite, indifferent. Confirmation of function rather than recognition. "Morning," Rhodes said. "Morning, Judge," Creel replied, flat and formal, his eyes never leaving the monitor. The gesture was routine. The words were routine. But between them, tension already hummed like the fluorescent lights overhead. The corridor beyond stretched straight and merciless, a geometric proof of authority. Each door led to offices where decisions were made, papers shuffled, and human lives weighed in silence. Portraits of past judges gazed down from high above, their expressions carved into permanence, unblinking. "Justice must be blind," the plaques read, though the blindness of the system often felt heavier than sight. Rhodes paused at the first portrait, a white-haired man from a time before accountability had a name. He studied the frozen smile and the bronze inscription, then looked down at the polished floor, catching his reflection fractured by sunlight. A ritual followed every morning. Badge clipped, robe adjusted, briefcase checked. Each gesture was acknowledgement to the machinery around him, a silent recognition that the system tolerated dignity only when it followed protocol. At the security desk, Creel's keys jingled again. He watched Rhodes disappear down the corridor, a shadow moving through the geometric perfection of the courthouse. Unaware of how the tension coiled like a spring around the inevitable rupture, the air smelled faintly of polish and fear, the subtle mixture of ambition and resignation. Clerks scuttled past, their shoes tapping the floor like nervous percussion. Attorneys, black coats sweeping the corridor, whispered in hurried tones to clients clutching papers like talismans. The courthouse thrummed with invisible power, each step an assertion that the machinery of law moved regardless of humanity inside it. Rhodes entered his chambers. Sparse oak furniture, shelves of organized files, a clock that ticked with bureaucratic exactitude. He placed the ID badge on the desk, letting it glint in the morning light. Its plastic surface reflected a simple truth. Legitimacy is given, never owned, and can be challenged at any instant. From outside, footsteps echoed faintly, deliberate and measured. Keys clicked again. The rhythm was almost musical, a reminder that authority had its own heartbeat, its own hidden timing. And somewhere beyond the polished floor and fluorescent hum, the first tremor of what would become the courtroom's fault line had already begun. By the time the bell tolled to open court, the machinery of justice was in place. Lawyers moved like choreographed pieces. Clerks carried stacks of files like ceremonial offerings, and the judge adjusted his robe one last time. The ID badge pinned to his chest reflected the light once more, small, gleaming, a symbol of order in a building built on control. Outside, Creel lingered, a silent observer. His hands toyed with the keys again, almost unconsciously. The courthouse had its rhythm, but even in that rhythm, something taut waited to snap, and when the fault line finally split open, it would not be the building that trembled. It would be everyone inside it, forced to reckon with the fragility of authority itself. The courtroom waited like a vessel holding its breath. Light slanted through the high windows, cutting the room into sharp rectangles of brightness and shadow. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, as if the air itself were reluctant to move. Every surface reflected order: polished wood of the benches, the gleam of brass nameplates, the marble floor that had borne decades of footsteps, each echo an argument in the unspoken language of power. Judge Emmanuel Rhodes entered with deliberate calm. His robe swished softly against the floor, a measured sound against the low murmur of attorneys and clerks. The gavel rested on the bench, small, wooden, innocuous, but it was enough to remind everyone who held authority here. He raised his hand once, brief, authoritative, and the murmurs died. Silence filled the gaps between words before proceedings began. At the plaintiff's table, Sergeant Mason Creel sat rigid, eyes flicking once to Rhodes before returning to the folder in front of him. His uniform was crisp, his posture erect, but there was a tautness to his hands, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a spring compressed beneath the weight of expectation. Across the aisle, the defendant, Malik Denner, sat hunched, fingers interlaced over a trembling knee. He avoided eye contact with anyone, a young man marked by exhaustion and caution, caught in a machine that had never been designed to nurture him. Rhodes cleared his throat softly. "Sergeant Creel," he began, his voice even, controlled, precise. "Please recount the events of the night in question, focusing on your immediate observations." Creel nodded, words careful, measured. "I was on routine patrol. I responded to a call, an altercation. When I arrived, the defendant was resisting arrest." Rhodes's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in observation. Each word, each pause, each inflection was data. He allowed the silence to stretch between Creeley's sentences, a weight pressing down on the officer as he spoke. "Resisting arrest," Rhodes repeated, calm but insistent. "Could you describe precisely what you observed? And specify the sequence of actions you took?" Creel shifted in his seat. His reply came, polished yet defensive, rehearsed yet shaky. There were gaps, minor contradictions, micro pauses that Rhodes noted with surgical precision. The defendant's hands trembled again. He was silent, but the room felt his tension as palpably as the echo of the gavel. Rhodes leaned forward slightly. "And the use of force. What determined your response? Were there other options considered in that moment?" Creel's jaw tightened. His voice was controlled, but for a fraction of a second the rigid armor slipped. The courtroom's attention wavered, unspoken curiosity dancing on the edge of decorum. The clerk shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding eye contact. She tapped a pen twice against the ledger, nervous percussion that only heightened the room's taut atmosphere. Through the blinds, the morning sun cast lines across the defendant's face. Each stripe of light was a sentence of its own, marking him like bars even before the gavel could. Rhodes paused. His hands rested lightly on the bench. He did not rush. Each silence was a tool, each careful look a scalpel, dissecting the performance in front of him. Creel began to stumble over a word, correcting himself quickly. The sound of correction, no louder than a whisper, reverberated through the room. The silence that followed was heavy, palpable, almost physical, pressing against the uniformed shoulders of the officer. "You are certain," Rhodes pressed, voice steady, deliberate, "that your memory of events is complete? That no detail has been omitted, intentionally or otherwise?" "Yes, Your Honor," Creel said. Yet the nod that accompanied the words felt brittle, fractured beneath the veneer of certainty. The judge leaned back, letting the pause stretch. The defendant's hands tightened into fists. The clerk's fingers hovered over her notes. Everyone in the room felt the gravity of the unspoken tension, as if the courtroom itself were holding its breath. The gavel lay still, a mute witness. But every eye in the room understood its presence. Authority was not only wielded in sound, it existed in posture, in pause, in observation. Rhodes rose slightly, straightening the robe over his shoulders. The lines of sunlight shifted, Glancing off the polished surfaces, he observed Creel, then the defendant, then the subtle choreography of everyone else in the room, the way fear, expectation, and civility collided in silent rhythm. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended, a fragile ecosystem of law and morality. Every movement mattered, every hesitation carried weight. The system itself seemed to watch, waiting for cracks, for the first tremor that would expose what lay beneath its polished surfaces. The gavel finally lifted, not to strike but as a reminder. The hearing had begun. Yet the true judgment, Rhodes knew, would unfold quietly, in the pauses, the micro-expressions, the small inconsistencies that revealed more than words ever could. And in that silence, controlled and deliberate, the machinery of justice began its slow, relentless work. The gavel hovered, suspended in Rhodes's hand, though it was not the instrument of rupture this morning. The room had already begun to fracture. He spoke quietly, deliberately, each word a scalpel cutting through the veneer of authority. Sergeant Creel, your testimony has been inconsistent. There are gaps, omissions, contradictions. I must weigh the credibility of your account accordingly. The effect was immediate but subtle at first. A faint tremor in Creel's jaw, a tightening around his eyes. The audience did not yet understand, but they sensed it. The thin membrane holding civility was beginning to tear. Creel's face reddened, not with anger alone, but with the shock of exposure. The uniform that had long granted him unquestioned presence now felt like a mask straining under pressure. Every breath he drew was sharp, measured. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, as if holding himself together might prevent the collapse. The silence thickened. The clerk's pen hovered over the ledger, waiting for a sound that did not come. The blinds across the windows cast fractured lines of sunlight across the polished wood, slicing the courtroom into segments of light and shadow. Rhodes's voice remained calm, surgical, precise. I cannot ignore these contradictions. Your account, you think you're better than me? Creel interrupted, the words sharp and brittle. The sound was sudden, almost violent against the rhythm of proceedings. The courtroom recoiled. The defendant flinched. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with anticipation. Yes, Rhodes said simply, voice low and unyielding. Better at discerning truth than convenience. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then the moment broke. The officer's hand rose, not in argument, not in explanation, but in an instant act that shattered every unspoken rule. The room slowed as if time itself dilated, the sound of contact resonating like a weapon discharged in a chamber meant for order. The gavel clattered to the floor, sharp and final. Rhodes's ID badge loosened from his robe, a small rectangle of plastic tumbling across polished wood. Its fall echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. The courtroom froze. Eyes widened, mouths opened, then closed again, unsure if any words could matter. The flag behind the bench remained still, still as if the wind itself had paused to witness. Rhodes did not move at first, not backward, not toward confrontation. He simply stood, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering. The mark left behind was not the story. The story was the refusal to allow the act to define him. His hand brushed the air near the badge, a gesture almost ceremonial, almost gentle. Creel's chest heaved beneath the uniform. His face burned, a map of sudden realization. The power he had wielded, built on fear, posture, and authority, had fractured in a heartbeat. The room, previously a sanctuary of procedure, had become a mirror, reflecting his own moral collapse. The defendant's hands clenched, trembling, as if instinctively understanding the shift of power. Silence carried its own weight, heavier than gavel strikes, more binding than robes or keys or badges. Rhodes finally spoke, voice steady, deliberate, measured. Order will be restored. Respect the courtroom or you will answer for this. Creel did not respond. He could not. Words had failed him. The sound of the impact still echoed in the mind, lingering longer than the moment itself. Outside, the corridors continued their quiet rhythm, indifferent to the rupture inside. Yet within these walls, the fracture was complete. Authority no longer guaranteed obedience. Uniforms no longer guaranteed deference, and silence, for a brief, incandescent moment, became the only measure of dignity. The badge lay on the floor. plastic and gleaming, a small emblem of what had passed and what had shifted. It waited like a witness until hands reached for it again. And all the while, the courthouse itself seemed to breathe, slow, deliberate, indifferent, yet carrying the memory of the tremor that had split its order. The courtroom did not breathe. Time dilated. The echo of the strike lingered, vibrating against wood and marble as though the walls themselves remembered. Every person in the room, attorneys, clerks, spectators, remained frozen, caught between instinct and the impossibility of comprehension. Sergeant Mason Creel's own breathing was suddenly loud, harsh, a ragged punctuation in the silence. His hands twitched, first against the desk, then across his lap, as if searching for some tether to the authority he had just shattered. His uniform felt heavy now, a costume that betrayed him with every crease, every button reflecting the overhead fluorescent glare. Judge Emmanuel Rhodes stood motionless. The mark on his face, small yet vivid under the harsh white light, was a signal not of weakness but of refusal. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply stood, and in standing reclaimed the room. The gavel lay on the floor, inert. The ID badge rested beside it, plastic catching the light like a silent witness. No one dared touch either. Each object seemed to hum with significance. Authority disrupted, legitimacy tested, dignity preserved. The clerk's pen wavered in midair. The sound of shuffling papers ceased. Even the air conditioning, mechanical and persistent, seemed muted, as if the courthouse itself were holding its breath. Footsteps approached from the corridor outside, hollow and deliberate. The sound, normally banal, now carried the weight of reality, of consequences, of hierarchy broken, of the machine exposed to human error. Security guards exchanged glances. Hesitation lingered in their posture, fingers near radios, ready but uncertain whose command to follow now. Creel's face flushed further. The room had contracted around him. Every pair of eyes, every subtle movement turned him smaller. His authority, built over years of uniformed presence, relied on compliance, on fear, on rituals. All of it had crumbled in an instant, and Rhodes did not speak. Silence became the instrument of judgment. Stillness became a form of violence more precise than any word. In that calculated pause, every person understood the inversion. Power no longer flowed from rank or armament. It flowed from dignity, from restraint, from unbroken principle. The defendant, Malik Denner, shifted slightly in his seat, fingers clasping tighter. Even he recognized the magnitude of the shift, that moment where decorum outlasted aggression, where justice did not need to strike to assert itself. Above, the fluorescent tubes flickered once. A pulse of imperfect light swept across Rhodes's robe, across the fallen badge, across Creel's twitching hands. The imperfection was insignificant to the building, but monumental to the men beneath it. The system continued its rhythm, yet for the first time, the machinery acknowledged the fracture. Minutes stretched like hours. One by one, people exhaled. The courtroom did not collapse. It merely reset itself, cautious, wary. Every footstep, every sound thereafter carried the memory of the rupture, the proof that authority could be challenged, and that silence could enforce its own reckoning. Rhodes finally adjusted his robe. His hand brushed near the badge without picking it up. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was a quiet claim. Dignity preserved, power redefined. Creel remained seated, shoulders slumped, as if the walls themselves weighed him down. The officer who had struck a judge now seemed adrift, diminished not by punishment, but by the simple, unyielding measure of upright restraint. The courthouse hummed again, mechanical, indifferent. Yet beneath its polished floors and marble walls, the memory of the fault line lingered, unhealed, unspoken, and unavoidable. Justice in that room had shifted. Not with a word, not with a strike, but with a stillness that burned brighter than any gavel. The walls were white and humming. Air conditioning vents lined the ceiling, exhaling cold, sterile breaths. The small room smelled faintly of plastic and disinfectant. Every surface reflected fluorescent light, amplifying the sense of scrutiny. The clock ticked with dry precision on the wall, each second measured, impartial, indifferent. Inside, officials moved like mechanized parts of a larger machine. District supervisors leaned over glossy tables, tapping keyboards and swapping folders. Internal affairs officers murmured into phones, their voices clipped, procedural, devoid of emotion. The presiding justice hovered at the edge of the room, arms crossed, listening more than speaking. The language had shifted. Words became buffers. Incident. Protocol. Containment. Each syllable drained the raw weight from what had occurred in the courtroom, wrapping the rupture in layers of bureaucracy. Timeline of events, one officer said, voice smooth, deliberate. We need a full review. Witness statements, internal logs, security footage. Containment measures are in place, another added. Media exposure is controlled. Preliminary statements drafted. Is the judge unharmed? Yes, physically. The matter is otherwise classified. The words echoed off walls that did not care, creating an antiseptic echo that swallowed urgency, fear, and shame alike. Meanwhile, Creel sat alone in a holding office down the hall. The chair creaked beneath him. His uniform felt heavy, suffocating. His hands rested on his knees, and for the first time he could hear them. The slight tremor, the subtle pulse, the weight of inevitability. He stared at them. Hands that had held authority. Hands that had struck. Hands that now seemed foreign. A plastic water bottle rattled faintly on the desk beside him. He reached for it, then withdrew, unsure if he wanted the distraction. The ticking wall clock counted the seconds, each one louder than the last, marking time that would not undo anything. He remembered Rhodes's eyes, calm, deliberate, unbroken, before the silence had claimed the room. Not angry, not reactive, just present. That stillness had been a verdict heavier than any gavel strike could deliver. The realization seeped into him slowly. No badge, no uniform, no procedure. None of it could mask what had already been done. The act was irreversible, lodged in memory, witnessed, undeniable. And the bureaucrats outside, for all their talk of containment, were irrelevant to the inner collapse he felt with each measured tick of the clock. Back in the conference room, files were shuffled. Timelines were reconstructed. Statements were rewritten to sound calm, rational, controlled. The officials spoke of damage management and protocol adherence, but in the careful monotone of their words, the moral gravity leaked away. One of the supervisors tapped her pen against a folder. We need to ensure this does not undermine public confidence. Perception is critical. Absolutely, another replied. Internal review scheduled. Nothing left unexamined. The words were hollow shields. The courthouse's polished floors outside had witnessed more than any statement could contain. The rupture had already traveled further than the bureaucracy could track. Creel's eyes drifted to the vent above. Cold air whispered into the office, circulating indifferently. It reminded him of the courthouse corridors, of the rooms where rules were made, maintained, enforced. Yet no air could cool the burning weight in his chest. He had acted. He had crossed a line. The plastic water bottle rattled again. He picked it up this time, feeling the condensation sweat against his fingers. The sound of liquid moving inside, gentle but unmistakable, mirrored the tremor inside him. Small, contained, but impossible to ignore. The clock ticked. The air vent whispered. The bureaucrats strategized. The system moved forward, neat and efficient. But in this small room, Creel realized, systems could not erase memory. Authority could not erase shame. And stillness, the same stillness Rhodes had commanded in the courtroom, could speak louder than any report, any protocol, any carefully drafted statement. He leaned back in the chair. The ceiling tiles above were blank, sterile, indifferent, and yet they seemed to bear witness, impartial but present, to the unraveling of a man who had believed he was untouchable. The press room smelled of paper, electronics, and the faint tang of disinfectant. Fluorescent tubes hummed with the same indifferent consistency as the courthouse hallways. Cameras lined the room, their lenses reflecting light in sharp circles across the polished floor. Microphones trembled slightly when touched, catching the subtle vibrations of whispered preparation. Judge Emmanuel Rhodes stepped forward. He adjusted the folds of his robe, set the glass of water before him, and straightened the microphone. The faint feedback hum was absorbed immediately into the silence that followed. He did not glance at the reporters, at the cameras, or at the murmuring staff. He faced the room as he had always faced the courthouse, deliberate, calm, uncompromising. He paused. One breath, The echo of authority. Today, he began, voice steady, measured, we confront not an act of violence alone, but the conditions that allowed it to feel possible. Not merely the hand raised, but the silence that permits such hands to exist in spaces designed for justice. The cameras caught the reflection of his face in the polished lens, fractured by the bright studio lights. Each observer felt the weight of the pause that followed. Not emptiness, but a space for reckoning. Rhodes spoke slowly, deliberately. The law is not only written in codes and statutes. It lives in practice, in how we respond, how we witness, how we remain silent or act. Every failure to observe, every hesitation to intervene, reinforces a system that allows dignity to be questioned, humanity to be diminished. The glass of water trembled slightly as he set his hand beside it. Small gestures carried meaning. Each movement precise, deliberate, symbolic. The water reflected the room's harsh light, refracting the moment into shards of awareness. No statement today seeks vengeance. There will be no calls for retribution here. There is only recognition. Recognition that silence is often complicity, that respect and dignity are not optional, and that authority must never be confused with immunity. The room absorbed each word, as if the air itself were being measured. Microphones hummed. Recorders clicked. The press, trained to extract drama from chaos, found none. There was no spectacle, no shout, no finger pointed. Only presence, only the slow, deliberate force of moral clarity. Rhodes paused again. The reflection in the camera lens caught the faint lines of fatigue on his face, the shadow of the mark still visible beneath the courthouse lights. It did not diminish him. It amplified the weight of his words. Every observer understood that dignity does not rely on unbroken flesh, only unbroken principle. Let this statement serve as a reminder, he continued, that the system is only as just as the vigilance of those within it. That authority must always be accountable, and that each individual, regardless of uniform, badge, or title, bears responsibility for the humanity of those before them. A reporter cleared their throat. Rhodes did not flinch. He allowed the silence to extend, carrying his message without need for repetition. The pause was a measure of power. Not loud, not violent, but absolute. When he finally stepped back, he lifted the glass of water in a slow, deliberate gesture, taking a single sip. The sound, small yet precise, punctuated the end of his statement. No applause followed. The room remained suspended in thought, each person left to reckon privately with the weight of what had been said. The fluorescent light flickered once, almost imperceptibly. Rhodes's reflection shimmered briefly across the camera lens. The statement was complete. The message delivered. The courthouse, indifferent but watchful, had borne witness to clarity that no action could undo. Outside, corridors hummed with habitual rhythm. But within this room, in this precise intersection of light and sound and moral intent, the ripple of truth lingered. It would extend farther than any report, longer than any press cycle, deeper than the procedural machinery could erase. Justice, in its purest form, had spoken. The corridors were unchanged, but the courthouse no longer felt the same. Fluorescent tubes buzzed with the same indifferent hum as before. Marble floors gleamed, polished to the point of perfection. Dust motes floated lazily through the shafts of morning light, yet every reflection now carried memory, not just of procedure, but of rupture. Administrative offices were alive with quiet movement. Reports were drafted, rewritten, classified. Press releases issued statements that sounded like apologies, but functioned primarily as shields. Each sentence carefully constructed to soothe public outrage while protecting institutional reputation. Words like incident, review, and protocol were repeated with mechanical precision, stripped of moral content, yet heavy with implication. Judge Mason Creel no longer appeared in the halls. His desk was empty. The echo of his footsteps vanished before the marble could register them. His career had collapsed quietly, not with spectacle, not with scandal, but with the slow attrition of authority withdrawn and credibility shattered. Judge Emmanuel Rhodes walked the corridors as he always had, robe draped over one arm, briefcase in the other. His face, unmarred by anger or indulgence, had become a symbol, not of personal suffering, but of the endurance of principle. The mark that had once been visible beneath fluorescent light was gone, healed. irrelevant to the moral clarity he carried in its stead. He approached the same security desk from Chapter 1. The ID badge rested in his hand, a small rectangle of plastic imbued with meaning that went far beyond its function. He lifted it, clipped it once more to his chest. The gesture was identical yet utterly transformed. This time it was not a claim of mere legitimacy, nor a ritual of obedience to the system. It was a quiet assertion of presence, of dignity preserved, of authority measured by restraint and observation rather than fear or uniform. The security officer at the desk offered a nod. Polite, brief, respectful, not fearful. The subtle difference carried weight. The corridor stretched ahead in perfect geometry, each doorway a reminder of procedure, each panel of sunlight slicing the floor like the scoring of time itself. The building breathed with the same mechanical rhythm, yet within its polished walls the echoes of rupture lingered. Each file shuffled, each clerk's step, each hum of fluorescent light now carried memory, a faint but persistent acknowledgement that systems, no matter how rigid, could bend under moral force. Rhodes paused in the middle of the corridor. The light fell across his face, clean and sharp, revealing nothing but intent. He adjusted the robe over his shoulder and walked on, each step measured, deliberate. The courthouse remained indifferent, but the air itself had shifted. Silence was no longer merely absence. It had become witness. The corridors, once purely functional, now held testimony in their stillness, recording the tremors of authority and the weight of accountability. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Lives continued, laws were observed, routines endured. But within these walls, the subtle realignment had occurred. Integrity, stillness, and observation had claimed a victory the system could not erase. The ID badge glinted once more in the light, small, precise, unyielding, a symbol of principle rather than mere position. And for the first time, the corridor did not simply measure the movement of men. It measured the endurance of what they could not erase. Moral clarity, justice, silent and deliberate, had watched itself,